Welcome back to another Spirit Island video. In this video, we're going to be talking about a strategy guide for Sweden. This is going to cover all levels of Sweden, including Sweden 6. I'm going to talk about events, minors, majors, spirits, pretty much everything to do with this adversary and how to take this adversary down. So, let's get started. Let's look at Sweden. And the first thing that I'm going to point out is that there's no additional loss condition. So this is one of the few adversaries where there is not an additional way that you can lose the game. The other one is Prussia. Next, we have the escalation, and it says swayed by the invaders. After the invaders explore, now this is meaning successfully explore into each land this phase. If that land has at least as many invaders as Dahan, replace a Dahan with a town. This is a very tricky escalation to play around, and this is why having Dahan movement can be very favorable. Let's look and show what this escalation does. So, if I have a Dahan here in my A2, when the stage 2 wetlands explores, I'm hoping it was mountain, or I was hoping it was wetland, but it was mountain. Well, of course the wetland doesn't show up. But so when that stage 2 wetland shows up, I'm going to explore in both of my lands. I then will trigger this escalation. It says after invaders explore, I explored. If the land has as many invaders as Dahan, I have 2 invaders to 1 Dahan. So this would trigger. I would then replace 1 Dahan with a town. So I would get hit with an escalation here on A2. That's that wetlands. So one of the tricks that we like to do into Sweden is we want to pair up our Dahan such that they outnumber the possibility of the Explorer occurring. So if I look here on my sands and my jungle, if the sands Explorer comes up, you'll notice there is not as many invaders as Dahan, so the escalation doesn't occur. So this is one of the ways that you can get ahead for Sweden is either one, purposely killing your Dahan such that they don't escalate, or 2, setting them up such that the Dahan will always outnumber invaders. Now, one of the problem explorers that could occur is, let's say we have, I'm trying to think, let's grab the sands. Of course, both sands were there. So let's say it looks like this. And it looks like this. So our mountain's ravaged, our sands is going to build, and now our first stage 2 explorer is the back-to-back, and that causes an instant escalation here. So they would explore both lands, and then because they would outnumber or equal the Dahan, a Dahan gets replaced with the town. And this is one of the edge cases that can occur in Sweden, is where you have this back-to-back build into an explorer of that same terrain type, you get instant escalated. And that's something that when you're playing this adversary, you're going to want to try to play around it if you can. Some spirits, you can't play around it. Other spirits, you can. So that is just one of the edge cases that I'm pointing out. And let me reset this board here. Okay, so that is the Sweden escalation. Let's take a look at Sweden 1. So it says heavy mining. It says if the invaders do at least 6 damage in a land during the ravage, add an extra blight. And it says that that extra blight does not cascade. So if I do 6 damage, looking here, if I have 2 towns and a city, I'm going to be doing 7 damage here. So because of that, Sweden 1 triggers. It'll add an extra blight, and then there will be a single cascade. And that is that Sweden 1 ability. Sweden 2 is going to add a city in land number 4. And then, if there's a starting blighted land 4, it gets pushed to land 5. Now, there are some boards where that occurs. I'm not going to, here's all of the boards. You can look and see which ones. It's not as important for the purpose of this video. Sweden 3, it says towns will do 3 damage instead of 2, and cities will do 5 damage instead of 3. So this is going to increase the damage, and it synergizes with Sweden 1 trying to hit that 6 damage threshold. And over here, you'll notice I have a town explorer in a 4 and a city town explorer, which I have a 9. And this is just showing how much damage this is going to be, because you're either going to commonly see a town explorer, or you're going to commonly see a city town explorer. And this is so important because the damage threshold of 4 means you need a defend 3 to successfully defend against it. And now 3 will actually, you're vulnerable to edge cases now. Any increase in damage from the event will cause you to blight. So if you look, there's a lot of spirits, like green, for instance, with that right innate, all enveloping green. It has defend 2, or many mines. The right innate first tier, that defend 2. There are plenty of spirits where that defend 2 isn't good enough into this town explorer. And the spirits need to be more creative if they want to defend against this ravage. So maybe instead they might try to do the fast tempo many mines build where you go to 3 plays, which I talk about in my many mines video. Or maybe you go for the defend 4 but have a worse turn 3 with green. And I talk about that in my green guide videos. So there are plenty of ways to play around it, but because of the extra damage, you might have to open differently. And as you can see, the City Town Explorer doing 9 damage, that is pretty absurd. So that Sweden 3 buffing up and causing that Sweden 1 trigger. Sweden 4, this is probably the most devastating part of this entire adversary, and it's called royal backing. It doesn't say it here, but it's royal backing. And essentially what this is, it's going to be deck acceleration, and then you're going to add a town to the discarded terrain to the fewest invaders. So I'm going to showcase that right now. Let's say the deck looked like this. Set up like that. So what I'm going to do is I have my initial explorer like normal. It'd be jungle in this case. Explore and explore. After that passes, I will then roll backing, discarding the top card into or a discard of the invader deck into the discard. So it'd be mountains. And now I have to add a town into that land type. So I would look at my board and I can either add the town to here or here. And it has to be in the land with the fewest invaders. So if I was on board B, I would have to add it to B7. Now, for the purpose of this example, I have board A, and this is actually very interesting. I can either add it to B6 or B1. The correct answer is B6, and the reason is, remember how I talked about in stage 2? Stage 2 is right around the corner. If the stage 2 is a mountain, which just happens to be, I would then get escalated here, explore, explore, and then it would escalate. We talked about that already, causing it to Han. So as you can see, I have 2 towns in Explorer. That's a terrible land to deal with. Because remember, they're all going to be doing 3 damage. So this is already 7 damage. They're going to build a city. It's so painful. But it's only 1 painful land. Now, if you look, if I roll backing into my A1, so now, let's say the same thing happens. They do our Explore, or Ravage, our builds, and the Explorer's Mountain. Well, now, I still get hit with the escalation. Now, all of a sudden, instead of having 1 really bad land, I now have 2 bad lands. 2 lands that are very difficult for us to handle. So, some of the boards, this is something that you may consider. The main ones is board A with the mountains. I believe board F is another one. Where's board F? Here with the wetlands. Sometimes I choose to just escalate here, just for that very reason. It's more obvious with board A because this is inland, and with F3, sometimes you might not want to do this because it's coastal. So there's a 2 out of 5 chance of it coming up, versus the 1 out of 5 for the mountains. But let's see if there's another one. Another one would be I guess you have to do B1. E1 is another one where if Sands comes up, I would roll backing into E1 likely just because of that escalation rule. Now, it's not always the case for the roll backing to be in that land. Like if you're playing a spirit that has a lot of Dahan movement, you might still roll backing here because you'll group these Dahan up, but it's something to consider. Okay, so we talked about that. So number 5, this is Mining Rush. It says when Ravaging adds at least 1 blight, also add a town to an adjacent land without buildings. essentially this is going to give Sweden a little bit of staying power, but it's tied to your ravages. So as you can see, level 1, level 3, and level 5 are all built around the ravage step. So the way to tackle this is if you disrupt the ravage step, then you're going to get very far ahead. And that is the way, or that's one of the ways how you beat Sweden. Something to point out about the Mining Rush is it says adjacent land. So if you have any cards that have the isolation effect, so a good example would be Roiling Bog here, where it says isolate the land. If you're isolating this land, that means there's no adjacent lands. So then you don't have to Mining Rush. So that's one of the ways to stop the level 5 roll. And actually, that's one of the ways that you can stop the escalation. I probably should have mentioned that earlier. Is after invaders explore, it has to be a successful explore. So if there's a wilds token in that land, if there's a wilds token, animated rack root in that land, there isn't a successful explorer, so there's no escalation. The same thing goes with isolation. And that's a lot of times you'll see players, they might isolate this mountain such that they can dodge that that explorer, and then they can prevent that escalation. So just a couple things that you can do to prevent the escalations as well. We talked about level 5, and finally, level 6 is just more buildings to the board. It's going to add a town and a extra blight to land number 8. So as I mentioned earlier, you have level 1, 3, and 5 are all dealing with the Ravage step. 2 and 6 are just adding stuff to the board. And then level 4 is adding stuff to the board and is deck acceleration. So as you guys can see, it's all dealing with the Ravage step. So one of the ways that we tackle this adversary is if you do fast damage, you do fast disruption, if you do control. These are all very powerful tools into this adversary because all you're trying to do is stop those ravages from occurring, because that's where Sweden is its strongest. Typically, defensive spirits have, I shouldn't say a tough time, because there's different forms of defense. Like skips are the best defense against Sweden, but just raw defense tends to be weak. Luckily, a lot of defensive spirits have that have a skip built into the kit, but spirits that rely solely on defense might have problems. So like Eyes tends to be pretty solid in this matchup, but there are some edge case explorers that can really hurt you. Just because you might be facing down 9 damage that comes up multiple times. So I mean, I still think Eyes is a very solid spirit into this adversary. It's just a little bit on the trickier end. So we've talked about all of the rules of Sweden. I'm now going to show you guys the boards. And this is probably the most important thing in this entire video, so really listen up. I know a lot of players, when I start talking about boards, they tend to just throw it all out the window. They think it really doesn't matter what board you start on, but really it does. And against Sweden, it is the most important thing about this adversary. So I have all 8 boards in Spirit Island listed out here. You're going to see a ton of different colors, dots, everything. The first thing I want to point out is each board is going to start with 4 buildings plus 1. And that one building that gets added is going to be from that rural backing. And I don't know where that rural backing is going to occur. I just know it will occur. So you're going to be having 5 buildings to start the game. The first thing you want to look at all of your boards is there a land type with no buildings? That is going to be your positive explorer. If that explorer occurs, you're going to be far ahead. And this is one of the reasons why I don't like Sweden, and it's because it's very RNG heavy based on the explorers early on. You can either have a very difficult game or a very easy game. For instance, if I'm on board D, you can see the blue dots. That means there's no buildings there. If these lands come up, I'm not going to be facing any cities. So it's going to be very easy for me to disrupt these lands. But now if you look, if my sands comes up, which I have in red dots, I'll be facing down 2 city lands, which means I'm going to be facing down 2 lands of 9 damage. So the difference of wetlands versus sands is the difference between me having a very easy game and me having a very difficult game. And the spirits that are very good into Sweden, they don't care if you have a difficult ravage, they tend to still do really well. While spirits that are weaker into Sweden, if that difficult ravage comes up, they're going to be in trouble. So looking at board D here, you're going to have the two blue dots. You have that wetlands is your good explorer, sands is your bad explorer. The other thing that I've pointed out is I have the number 4 here. And this is telling me how many land types I have buildings in. So you're going to see I have the possibility of 4 city ravages and 3 land types. We have the jungle, the sands is our really bad one, and then our mountain. Looking over here at board B, our good explorer is our sands, our bad explorer is our jungle. And once again, we have 4 land types with buildings. Let's look at board A here. This is one of our better boards, and that is because there's only 3 lands with buildings. And that is because of Sweden 6 is going to hit our land 8, which happens to be our land that has the town. So I tend to rate board A as one of the better Sweden boards because there's a higher chance of us having an easier explorer. For instance, mountain, there's no buildings. Jungle, we double up here. We then have a single building here and a single building here. So there's a 75% chance of us having a single city ravage, but there is a 0% chance of us having a ravage that has both, that has 2 cities being there. So that they'll never have that crazy brutal ravage that board B or board D has. But now if our jungle comes up on A8, that's going to be a problematic land, but it's only one problematic land. So let's now look at board F. Once again, it only has 3 lands with buildings, our sands, mountain, and jungle. This happens to be one of my favorite Sweden boards, mainly because both our wetlands are locked off by buildings. And you'll notice here, it says mining rush. It says when ravaging adds 1 blight, add a building to an adjacent land without buildings. So if you can see here, because all your adjacent lands have buildings here, if you let either of these wetlands just ravage and just, you're just like, whatever, let it blight, you don't have to mining rush. Now, of course, we're playing adjacency with other boards, so we'll have to mining rush here or here, but in solo, you don't have to. And that's another thing you can do with board D on board D3. It's kind of crazy, I know, like where all the little spots are, where you can just let the blight go through and you don't have to mining rush. But now you might be saying, wait a minute, you can also do that here on A3. You really don't, because there's Dahan and you want to protect your Dahan. But yeah, there's little spots here where you can just let the blight go and you don't have to mining rush. And I've already talked about, yeah, so board F, went through all of that. Let's look at board E. Board E is another one of those tough boards where you have 4 different lands with buildings, and your wetlands is another tough explorer. Let's look at board G. This is, I actually regard board G as being the best Sweden board, and that is because it is the only board in the entire game where you'll have land type, 2 land types that can occur that doesn't have any buildings. You have your sands and your jungle. Every other board in the game, board H, board F, board A, there's only 1. But board G, there's 2. Now, there is also that negative. That negative is you have 2 fully established cities in your wetlands, and you have your double towns and a blight doubled up on your inland land 8. So there are some problems there, of course, but this is one of those boards that tends to be very favorable for a lot of spirits, because just play the odds. If jungles and sands comes up, you're going to do great. Of course, if that wetlands comes up, you might have some issues, but it's one of those boards where sometimes you might just want to take the odds. Looking at board H here, once again, you have your 4 lands. Sands is another pretty scary one. Jungle is your good explorer. And finally, we have board C, and this is regarded as one of the better boards in general, but I rate it as not that good of a board into Sweden. Now, it's not true for all spirits, but for a lot of spirits. And you'll notice there's no blue dots or red dots. That is because this is the only board in the game where no matter what the explorer is, you're always going to be facing a city ravage. If you look, there's always a single explorer on the rest of the boards where you might be able to dodge one. Board C doesn't matter, you're facing it. You're going to be facing that city ravage. So spirits with skips tend to be very favorable on board C. Now, one of the good things about board C is you can easily group up your Dahan. They're all very localized, so you can pair them up and you can try to dodge those Sweden escalations. On boards like board A or board F, you're pretty much like this Dahan and this Dahan and this Dahan. These guys are all Gauders. It's going to be very hard to move them around unless you have Dahan. I mean, if you have Dahan movement, you might be able to get it to go. But like this guy is going to require 2 movements to survive. Same thing with this guy, 1, 2. So there, the one benefit to board C is like if you have a Dahan push turn 1, you can push these Dahan and pair them all up. Okay, so you're going to notice I have these pink stars here. And these are going to indicate boards that have their land 8 with the blight lining up with a city. So these are just very dangerous boards. They're not bad boards per se. I don't even know what the worst board is. I know I said C, but I know some spirits love board C into Sweden. But I'm just making notes. Board B, board E, and board H are boards where, oh look, that is not a good explore for us, right? Our land 8 coming up as well as our city land. The last thing that I have is, well, I guess I already touched up, but I have this interesting looking star, and that's just to indicate that this is a board that's going to have a city ravage every turn. So just reiterating that point. So down here, I have all of the different terrain types, and you're going to see I have numbers. This is going to say how many cities or how many buildings are on that terrain type. As you can see, wetland it has the most buildings. If I count all of the buildings across all of the boards, it's 8. And I'll just do that right now. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. All of the other terrain types, it has 7. So a lot of players, they say, what is the most dangerous land type? It tends to be wetlands. Wetlands in general. I know we're talking about Sweden here, but wetlands for a lot of boards and for a lot of adversaries tends to be the most challenging. For instance, getting a little off topic, but Russia on board F, you have 2 explorers to start when this explores. Actually, I should put the other beast there. On board F, you'll have 2 of your beasts and that starting wetland. Insane. On top of, you'll start with an extra explorer, so then they explore there, they're going to have 6 damage. So this is like a huge edge case for you. There's other reasons as well if you go through the different adversaries, but wetlands tends to be just the most brutal for a lot of spirits. Now, if you look below here, I have the little smiley face, and this is just indicating how many of those blue dot explorers that you have. So remember the blue dot here on board D, or the blue dot on board H. So you'll have, there's a total of 2 blue dots for wetlands, 2 for jungle, only 1 for mountain, but there's the most for sands. So judging by this data here, in this data alone, the only possible conclusion is that Sands is the best explorer. I don't know. I'm just saying that, but I mean, if you actually look at it, right, you have the fewest buildings and you have the best possible explorers. If you took these 3 boards, now maybe there's a strategy where you might want to diversify the explorers, and honestly, that's probably the best, right? You take maybe like board G, and then because your wetlands is a bad explorer, but jungle is a good explorer, maybe you pair that up with a board that has a bad jungle explorer. So maybe you take like board B, for instance, where you have a really bad explorer here, but then all of a sudden your explorer is good here. And this is assuming you're picking boards, but just something to think about with the different possibilities of explorers and what's considered good or bad. Okay, I've talked a lot. Let's look at some events here. These are going to be some events that I find just interesting into the adversary. They have interesting interactions. The first 2 is going to be map makers as well as the frontier calls. And both of these cards are going to be adding extra explorers. So map makers, it says explore actions, add +1 explorers. Why does that matter? Well, maybe my A7 is empty, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm fine, I can dodge escalations, but oh wait, Mapmakers comes up, and now, when this land explores, 2 explorers come down. And then, the escalation will trigger, which will cause an escalation. So Map Makers is one of those cards that can kind of get around your safe lands. So something to think about. Um, Another thing to point out is just adding Dahan, Coming of Age, using the Dahan ads to dodge the escalations is something to consider as well. What else? Yeah, so Frontier Calls is basically the same. The next thing here is I have Sprawl contained, mainly just because I wanted to talk about the wilds. As I mentioned earlier, adding wilds may stop escalations. So if I get Sprawl contained into this adversary, okay, sure, I'll build here, but now I get to add that wilds. Well, you know what? That wilds is going right here in A6 because now I know this Dahan will be protected from the escalation. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can disrupt the Ravage cycle, if you disrupt that Explorer, that build, or that Ravage, then the land won't be blighting, and then they're not going to be able to propel themselves forward. So wilds, not only am I going to stop the escalation here, but I'm also going to stop that build Ravage cycle, which is going to give me a ton of tempo. Hardworking Settlers, this I have here mainly because of the skip text, that bottom text here. Skips are so important against this adversary. Once again, as I mentioned, Sweden is all about ravaging and dealing damage and getting ahead from the ravages. If you skip the ravages, they're not doing that, and they're gonna fall behind, and they're gonna kind of grind to a halt. The next one is Gradual Corruption. I have this here because of that Sweden 4. Sweden 4 is adding a card into the discard with royal backing. So that's an extra card that you'll have to pay for that Gradual Corruption. So if this is your first event that flips, a lot of times it's just free Dahan ad. You don't have to worry about the top part. Against Sweden, nope, you do. It costs an extra energy. And lastly, I have Accumulated Devastation here for two reasons. One, the Isolate, once again, just talking about how that cancels out Sweden 5, but also it's increasing damage. So any event that increases damage is going to possibly push the invaders over that the damage threshold and cause that Sweden 1 extra blight, or just cause blight in general. And that is just some events that can occur. And I think I had Thriving Trade as well. Thriving Trade, this one's just a really, really crazy one. Like if you have this land exploring, right? Explored, it's ravaging now. It's only 6 damage. Thriving Trade adds that, where is it? Thriving Trade adds that coastal city, which is going to add +5 damage to the coastal land. So it's kind of ridiculous. Okay, so we talked about some events here. Let's look at some minors. And I'm not going to go through all of the minors in this video. I'm just trying to point out some things that are really important. The first one is cards like Rain of Blood, cards like Gift of Power. These support style effects or fear-based cards, while they could be good against Sweden, you will win if the game goes long. You just need to stall the game out and prevent the adversary from ravaging. And this is a card that doesn't do that. It's a card that just generates fear, so that's not really that important against this adversary. In Gift of Power, usually it's a great card, but against here, we need cards that impact the board, and this is a card that kind of gets us ahead with our cards, and that's not really good against Sweden. Another one is Renewing Rain. Blight Healing it's not really that good in the Sweden, just because they're adding double blight from Sweden 1, and then whenever they're adding blight, they're adding those adjacent towns, and that can be very problematic. So these are 3 effects that I'm not really looking for. One of the cards that I thought was pretty funny was Razor Sharp. Adding that wilds is amazing, but killing Dahan is actually kind of favorable here. Like if I'm on board A here, and let's say Mountain Explorers, heck, I'm going to play Razor Sharp. I'm going to stop that build. I'm going to add that wilds, preventing the future Explorer, and I'm going to kill that Dahan. Who cares about the Dahan? I just don't want there to be an escalation. And now I know with one card play, I've stopped the land from coming up, from ravaging, but as well as coming up again. That is that Razor Sharp. Fire in the Sky, or just strife effects in general, tend to be very favorable here, because it doesn't matter if your city is doing 3 damage or if it's doing 5 damage, the Strife is going to cancel all of that damage. So as you can imagine, spirits that have Strife, scrolls up to look at Trickster or Wandering Voice, these are spirits that are going to be very strong into this adversary. I have scoured the land here just because it's a way to destroy a lot of buildings and a lot of explorers. I know it adds blight, but maybe it's better than the land getting out of control. Confounding Mists, I have it here as a interesting card that can push lands or push buildings that are built. And this could be critical to stopping a land that just built a city. And normally this is not a card I'm considering, but against Sweden, you might consider it just because once again, Sweden is all about having those big built up ravages. So any card that can disrupt or reduce those ravages so that you can control them is going to be very favorable. Card like Quicken, a very nice defend 10. We have Call to Ferocity, just a very flexible card. You can use it as Dahan movement, but you can also use it as disruption. So like maybe you play Call to Ferocity turn 1, and let's say it was Wetlands. Let's say Wetlands built, and the follow Explorer is Sands. Well now, maybe I played Call to Ferocity originally because I wanted to gather all of my Dahan into here. Well maybe now I want to use it to stop this build here. Because once again, Sweden is not going to be an adversary. Once you're stopping those builds, they're not going to be able to get buildings there. Unless, of course, you let them ravage, which you don't do that. So, like, this is a card that's just so flexible. Call to Guard, very similar. You're moving Dahan, so you can try to dodge those Sweden escalations, but then you can also set it up as a Dahan defend. Like, for instance, here. Maybe my jungle is what came up. I quickly reset the board. Maybe my jungle came up and it now built. Well, now I drew Call to Guard. I can stop the Dahan from getting escalated here, and I get to defend 3 here. So it does 2 things for me. Mesmerize Tranquility. I already talked about the power of isolation. Land of Haunted Embers tends to be a card that people don't like, and I don't like it either, but against Sweden, this card has saved me so many times. And mainly because of these stupid land 8s that come up. I've had games where that jungle comes up, turn 1, and I'm like, oh man, I need an answer for this. And I grab Land of Haunted Embers, and I'm like, you want to know what? I will take the Cascade now, but now I can move all of this later, and now I don't have to deal with this land. I don't have to worry about a city being built. And usually that's a desperate play that I'm doing if I don't have a way to interact with this land already. Like if the alternative was it builds a city and takes 3 blight in a mining rush, heck, I'd rather just use Land of Haunted Embers and just take the 2 blight. So hopefully that makes sense. Disorienting Landscape, once again, that Wilds disrupting and the Wilds stopping the Sweden escalation. Good old defensive tools tend to be good. They just need to be above defend 2. And Call to Isolation is another very powerful card. For instance, if you're on board B and Jungle Explorers, well, Call to Isolation completely solves your B8, pushes everything out. So now I'm missing one card, right? I guess I threw the card off to the side, and that is Call to Trade, one of the best cards in the game, and it is an absolute Sweden killer. This card alone will win you the game against this adversary. So if you ever see this card, pick it up. Does not matter what spirit you are. Doesn't matter if it's completely off element. This card is so strong, and that is because it is a Ravage skip. It says the first Ravage in target land this turn becomes a build. You could use this card to skip Ravages. So if, for instance, trying to find a good example, if board B occurs and it's Jungle Explorer, they then build, they then build, and let's say the follow-up is now Wetlands, I can play Call to Trade, gathering this town into B8, stopping the city build here. I then can gather the Dahan from B7, stopping the escalation here on B7, and then I skip the Ravage here. So I just did so much value for one card. And if this land ever comes up again, whatever. I'll just play Call to Trade again and skip it. So it's a permanent way to solve a problematic. Let me clear all of that. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. Okay, so we talked about some minors. It's time to look at the majors. And let me bring all of those back. Okay, major time. Now I just went through the major deck and I grabbed a bunch of cards. I'm not going to go through everything, just like with the minors. Well, but very strong defensive cards. I mean, Indom is just a god tier card all the time, and that defend 20 means that land doesn't ravage. So just a great card. Another card would be Instruments of Their Own Rune. You get to add a Strife, and then that Strifed Invader deals damage to other invaders in target land. Well, remember, cities do 5 damage. So now a single city can kill 2 towns and an explorer. For instance, if my land 8 comes up, it builds, I can play Instruments there, adding the Strife to the city, and then completely solving the land, killing the towns and the explorers. So it's just a very, very powerful card. Skips. I've already said this a couple times. Any card that skips the Ravage, you're skipping the Ravage, you're skipping 3 lines of text on Sweden. Paralyzing Fright does that, and generating a lot of fear. Pent-Up Calamity, allowing you to add Disease and Strife. This card I use so many times in this game, or against Sweden, is I play Pent-Up Calamity. Let's say I choose my land E6. Let's say Wetlands is, actually, let's choose Jungle. So Jungle, I choose here. In the fast, I then add the Strife, so I stop that town from ravaging, and then I add the Disease. So now I've stopped the city build, and then I've also solved the land for the follow-up turn. The card is just so, so, so good to this adversary. Pyro Flow, another card I use a lot. Let's say this land is about to build. Well, I can do 2 damage, kill the town, and then also kill the explorer. So fast damage is really critical. I know I drew a couple fast damage cards, but there's plenty other ones. Insatiable Hunger is another one that just, this card has saved me so many games, being able to kill those built up city lands fast. Now, one card that is actually pretty bad into this adversary is Unrelenting Growth, a card that is generally really strong, but here, not so much. Remember, those built up economic cards tend to be very bad into this adversary that's all front loaded, it's all heavy ravage based. Okay, the last part in this video, I'm just going to talk about some spirits. I was thinking about going through all of them, and I just said, you know what, this video is already almost 40 minutes, and I'm getting tired of talking. So what I have here is the first line of spirits are going to be spirits. These are first players that want a very easy win. These aren't all of the spirits in this category, but these are just spirits that I think completely trivialize this matchup. And you're going to notice 4 of them all have skips built into their kit. Relentless Gaze has Blinding Glare, which is a Ravage skip. Green has skips based on that special rule, choke the land with green. Starlight has Piece of the Nighttime Sky. If I can pull it up, which is another skip. Behemoth has Terrifying Rampage, which is another skip, if I can find it. Skipping land, they don't participate in ravages. And then I have Trickster here because it has tons and tons of strife, as well as cards like Incite the Mob, where a strifed invader deals damage. Remember I just said cities do 5 damage? Well, if you incite the mob on a city, you completely clean up a land. So these are just 5 spirits where if this is an adversary that you're struggling with, give one of these spirits a shot, and I'm sure it's going to make the matchup significantly easier. The next line of spirits, these are spirits that also have good matchups into Sweden. Once again, this isn't all of the spirits, it's just some of them. But I think these spirits require a little bit of thinking to actually win the game. It isn't as trivial as this top line of spirits, but they they are favorable matchups. You just got to actually think through the game and build a plan. And you'll notice 3 of them also have skips. Finder has a ton of fast control, and then Stone is just, well, Stone. Now, the bottom 5 spirits, these are spirits that I tend to think have a bad matchup or a very difficult matchup. Shadows, Keeper, these are spirits where if they have that really bad edge case Explorer, like, I'm pretty sure if I'm up against, if I'm playing the adversary and someone is playing base Shadows or maybe Foreboding Shadows, I'm pretty sure I can beat them by controlling the Explorers and the events. And that's just because this adversary is just so unforgiving. And Shadows just doesn't really have any ways to deal with those really built up lands like this land and this land. Like if these lands are building, you're pretty much screwed. Keeper is very similar to in that regard. And then Wounded Waters can't deal with cities until like turn 3. So that can be problematic. Bringer just can't deal with cities at all in the early game. In general, it can't deal with cities. Fangs is the only one that probably could go into this middle row, but I was trying to figure out one spirit more to put in this last row, and I was having trouble, so I put Fangs. This is probably one of Fangs' most challenging matchups outside of HME, and that is like there are some explorers that could be very, very difficult, especially if you get a bad board. Now it's not like it's it's not like you could never win. I've won plenty of games, but I do find that the spirit does tend to have some issues into this adversary. Well, that concludes this video. I hope this video was helpful for somebody that was struggling with Sweden and was just looking for some extra tips. If you like this video, like, subscribe for more content. I will see you guys in the next video.